Hello everyone, welcome to this webinar. We're excited to launch a virtual special issue at the Journal of Business Venturing Insights about entrepreneurial problems, scholarly impact, and the pursuit of solution-oriented research. For more details about this virtual special issue, please go to our website and take a look. In order to better prepare the potential authors to discuss their thoughts, know our expectations and the formats of submission, we organized a workshop on the 23rd of May. It was a 2-hour workshop divided into 2 parts. And for those who cannot attend the workshop but are interested in submitting to our virtual special issue, we're happy to make the first part available so you can go through and watch the 3 presentations with very important information about this virtual special issue. We hope you find it useful.
Information. We have a set of authority structures, status hierarchies, professional associations, communication sanctions. As anybody who's been through the conventional review process for an academic journal will appreciate, the sanctions sometimes can be very severe. We have ethical codes and sanctions. We have career structures and progressions. We have expectations that have to be met. Most of us have the experience of going through the appointment, promotion, and tenure process and have seen at firsthand the tyranny of the A journal rankings in terms of legitimizing what we do and do not do. But overall, we have a lack of internal coherence, I think, in the discipline. And partly as a result of that, we have a certain amount of external legitimacy problems. We have an increased emphasis in theory as entrepreneurship seeks to demonstrate its credentials as a quote-unquote pure or proper academic discipline. And that emphasis in theory and the concomitant emphasis on the A journals as the measure of what is good, again in inverted commas, I think is part of the problem that we face. If you go to the next one, Sue. My argument is that we simply cannot ignore the context within which we are working. And it's not a unique argument in terms of philosophy of science. Seidman back in the mid-80s talked about science as being socially constituted. The social context forms a normative context enhancing or impeding scientific rationality. It informs the very process of inquiry. And science in this sense is a symbolic form. It's a mode of structuring reality. It's embedded in the social structure of society. And to quote Gibson Burl and colleagues in the organization sciences, given the radically changed structural, theoretical, and ideological realities we face, what is required is intellectual renewal and regeneration. I don't think it's enough for us to continue to pursue the pursuit of entrepreneurship as a conventional academic discipline. So where do we go? Next slide, Sue. Is there one before that? Yeah, and this is what brings me to an orientation to problems. And it's kind of, using an architectural analogy, the traditional academic disciplines we can see as the columns of the intellectual edifice. They have a clear view of their theory, a clear view of the objects of study. It's still, despite the crossover potential, there's no difficulty in, or no problem in, or danger of confusing physics with biology or economics with politics. There may be interfaces and crossovers, but most academic disciplines have a reasonably strong sense of their own identity and focus. The multiplication of disciplines across the, across the social sciences is a bit like the specialization of labor in industrial capitalism. It becomes more and more specialized, more and more divisive. What I want to suggest is, in architectural terms, if the traditional disciplines are columns, entrepreneurship serves as a row, cross-cutting those columns in the intellectual edifice. It's an integrative applied field of study. And its identity, cohesion, and legitimacy comes not from trying to be theory-driven in the way conventional disciplines are, but from focusing on contemporary issues and problems, drawing on insights and materials from wherever. This means that there should be a focus on synergistic multiple perspectives. This is something that goes beyond just the sum of the disciplinary parts. Entrepreneurship is very good at borrowing from other disciplines. It's not, up to now, been very good at integrating those borrowings into something which is distinctive. And we do have to remember that solving academic problems is actually not the same thing as solving social problems. And we can write and develop arcane theoretically based papers which will solve the academic problem of how many angels dance on a pinhead without ever addressing social problems. And if you look at our top journals until very recently, the pursuit of theory rather than the pursuit of relevance has been characteristic. So what should we be doing? If you go to the next one, Sue. In terms of practical steps, and this is a very loose agenda, which the paper teases out in a little bit more detail, but some of this is speculative and needs further development. I think there are 5 elements that represent necessary steps. The first is a greater interaction between social conscience and philosophical awareness. We need to change the basis on which we think about the discipline. The specialization of academic disciplines essentially conflicts with the holistic and interconnectedness of the problem orientation approach. And the argument here would be, to go back to Seligman's discussion of social context, the problems we face are transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary. They are beyond the scope of any individual discipline to deal with. But we are not configured right across the sciences. We're not configured in a way that allows us to deal with these. That, for entrepreneurship, suggests that we might need to rethink where we stand on the structure-agency divide. Increasingly, entrepreneurship, and particularly in its North American or Anglo-Saxon, more generally Anglo-Saxon orientation, has taken a neoliberal individual agentic perspective, relying on the role of the individual as a change agent, and suggesting that part of this reorientation of the focus of the discipline needs to play up rather than play down the role of structures in constraining and channeling action. This leads to a contextual form of philosophizing, recognizing that the interaction with social problems and our intellectual endeavors is going to open the door to subjectivity. And that raises issues, particularly when we come to discussing problems, of determining what is relevant, to whom is it relevant, who decides? Who decides what a problem is? Who decides which problems should be prioritized? These are social choices and political choices. They're choices we have to engage with. And in doing so, we need to deal with and address the paradox of social problems. What is truth? What is illusion when we come to look at these problems? And I think elements of the call for papers for the special issue of the journal, I think, begin to touch on some of those questions. But I would also suggest that there is, there is a need to broaden the constituency with whom we are working. If we are dealing with problems and addressing problems, we need to think more specifically about the co-production of knowledge, working with those who are engaged in community action in addressing problems. That changes the modes of working that we follow. It changes the paradigms that we work within, our expectations as to how research is done. And it poses a challenge, finally, in terms of what we see as the markers of esteem and career progression. Because if we reorientate the discipline in this way, it is going to have implications for recognition and reward, which are still based on a paradigm of theory orientation. So where do we go? What's the challenge, finally? I'll just set this up and let you read the statements. There is a tension here. There is a shift that is required, and in making the shift from a theory orientation from the traditional disciplinary architecture of the sciences to a more integrative, holistic problem orientation, it's not going to be simple. It's not going to be straightforward. It's fine to articulate it in workshops like this. Doing it is undoubtedly going to be difficult, but it is essentially necessary. As the following quotation from one of my favorite poets, the Irish poet Lee McNeice, I think sums it up in terms of why we're having this conversation. Minute your gesture, but it must be made, your hazard, your act of defiance, and hymn of hate. Hatred of hatred, assertion of human values, which is now your only duty. Yes, my friends, it is your only duty. And it may be added, it is your only chance. For me, problem orientation and the challenges it poses is not a choice, but a necessity. And that's, I think, just about my 10 minutes worth.
Yeah, that's very good. Thank you very much, Richard. Especially the last quote, I like it very much. I think that's a very good finishing summary of your presentation, and also the starting statement for our special issue. So I think we have someone got some questions. But given the constraint of time, I would like to let Pablo to give more introduction to this special issue, and then we can take questions at the end, because we do need to have leave enough time for the breakout rooms. I hope that's fine with the question posed. That's free stuff. Yeah.
Cool. Right. My turn then. All right. Right. So welcome everyone. I'm Pablo. I'm professor of entrepreneurship at Durham, and also the editor-in-chief in the Journal of Business Venturing Insight. So, well, if you're all here, I guess you know a little about JBVI and what we do in the journal, and also about the special issue. Just to clarify a few things that I think are important here, and how what we are doing today aligns with our mission as a journal. This is the original mission, the same mission we have since the day of founding. So what we're trying to do, we're trying to enhance and speed up conversations, right, amongst ourselves, researchers, but also with practitioners. And we do that by offering a space for rapid dissemination of obviously research, new research that is related to entrepreneurship. So we try to keep it playful and experimental all the time, and that's how I think that the journal's been evolving over the last year. And within that, it's fairly unique, as you know. That's something that is important to think when you're framing your paper and think about the sort of a review process and how you're going to approach the review process, right? So it's we're very fast, and we're still fast, right? So after 7 years and a massive growth in numbers of submissions, we're still supercharged in terms of speed and accessibility. We're still aiming to have to stay with those sort of 3 months from submission to publication, if all goes well and the authors resubmit their papers on time. We're still very open to different disciplines, perspective, and methods. If you go through our the work we published, it's very varied, but again, it's a lot of experimental work, right? So they're playing with different methods and different disciplines and trying to bring other perspective from other social sciences or natural sciences into our space. It's in the sense that we try to keep things quick, right, and give people rapid access to knowledge. Obviously, these are ideas that normally do not met the threshold for completeness, robustness, and theoretic explanation that we normally see in more traditional journals such as JBB, ETB, which are more theory-driven journals that takes quite a lot of time to get through the review processes. And we try to bring different fields together, so don't be afraid of combining knowledge from different domains. And that, I think, is very important in JBBI as well, especially, I mean, in this understanding of problems, there's something to do with also the nature of them and how the sort of knowledge domains are interconnected and the kind of understanding of how problems work. And this is very important because, I mean, I guess everyone should know at this stage, right, after almost 8 years that we publish short papers, we're still getting 40-page long papers, which is very frustrating. So now that you're working towards the special issue, please, and don't send me an email that can I submit a 14-page paper, because it's a 12-page paper, right? So articles should not exceed 12 pages of text, double space, no cheating, double space, all the figures and tables and so on to the back of the paper. That's very important, right? In terms of the review process, things to keep in mind. So we only use one reviewer in one round review. That means that if the paper is not ready, it will likely get rejected immediately, right? So we're currently publishing, I think, overall acceptance rate, it's 13%, and we just reject, I guess, 80% of the papers. So most of the papers we put through are more in the sort of developmental engaging in a developmental process rather than an opportunity to see whether the paper is ready, right? So we put papers that they're ready to go. So you need to be able to get those papers ready, and the kind of activities we're organizing, like this one, is normally to help authors to get the papers where they need to be before submission. We try to keep it short. So with the reviewers, we only give them 5 bullet points and no more than 2 pages to get their message across. And then we, the editors, we act as a second reviewer, and based on agreement, we then provide guidance for the revision if there's an invitation to revise and resubmit. So that means that the final decision is with us, and we don't rely on the reviewers anymore. And that's again why we're trying to open the spaces for you to collaborate with the editors in the development of your papers, right? To try and align views and help you from day one. It's very important. So you might be aware that about 2 years ago we launched something called the Rapid Response Initiative in trying to address some of the challenges we're facing. And back to Richard's presentation, I mean, it's a term to address problems, right? That our communities, meaning entrepreneurs and organizations, are facing throughout the world, because currently management research, entrepreneurship research, for some reason, has been sort of detaching itself from the agents, right? The actors we're supposed to help, and it's been quite successful. And I guess what we're doing today, is scaling up from this initiative and trying to do something at the level of reflection as to how those problems emerge and what are actually those problems affecting entrepreneurs. So that took us into thinking about solution-oriented social science and the work of Watts and translational sciences and the research practice gap, collaboration, co-creation, and so on. So all of those things emerge when you start thinking about how can we make social science more solution-oriented. And that's what it got us thinking into and how this very special issue came into being, right? So when you start thinking about it, about the idea of solution-oriented social science, there are many problems with it, right? And I guess that's the very basic inspiration behind the special issue. We have the problems of interest, right? So that's how we judge theory, and we only ask a theory, so what? No, actually, what can we do with it? And that puts a limit to what we do as researchers and the solutions that we can provide. There's also a problem of language. We normally talk about sort of a gap contribution language, right? So there's a language of relationships, whereas practitioners, the people we're trying to solve problems for or solve the problems collaboratively with, they talk a language of means and ends, right? Is a language of technical norms. So that creates a massive misalignment between what we do in examination of relationships and what they want to do, what they want knowledge for, which is again technical norms that they can use to solve, right? In looking into the solve problems, looking into the future. And the other issue is that there's a problem with explaining the past. We normally, to be able to do our work, we look into the past phenomena, and then from that standpoint, we go and describe, explain, and then hopefully be able to predict what might happen next, assuming that social phenomena is relatively stable. But that again, when you're working with entrepreneurs, they're creating the world, like constructing the world as it happening, right? So, and what we do normally is misalign with what they need moving forward. It's not this is we need to turn it into consultancy work, but there has to be a way of working with them towards the future, right? So, and I guess a focus on problems and what's coming and what is emerging should allow us to engage in a process that is more conducive to solution. And the other problem, which is at the very core of the special issue, is the problem of temporal succession, where we normally work in beautiful research papers, and then when we get to the end, we're trying to find a problem to solve. But we know that problem precedes solutions, right? So not the other way around, generally, right? So we have a problem, and then we try to find a solution for it. So that we have a knowledge solution, right? And it starts like searching problems to solve, right? You could eventually, but it's a very inefficient way of solving problems, right? So that takes us to the special issue, and then you'll see how entrepreneurial problems are connected to solution-oriented social science and our interest of making an impact, right, beyond academia. And we've been studying problems in problem formulation with Garima and Sue, and we know that problems are very different from research questions, right? So when first of all, research questions deal with relationships, problems deal with technical norms, right? So they're very different in that sense. They don't have a theoretical orientation, right? So when you start thinking about a problem, there's a gap in literature, right? That's not the point. That's what research questions are for, to solve problems in literature, solve gaps in literature. Whereas here we have situations, right? Issues that being affecting entrepreneurial populations or support organizations or any sort of agent actor that's involved within the entrepreneurial phenomenon. So we're not trying to answer something to fill a gap and make a theoretical contribution. We're trying to identify either problem or the processes whereby we can formulate problems normally collaboratively, right? So working together with those being affected by those problems, right? So I'll make a quick reference and example of what a thick description of a problem would be, and then I'll pass it on to Garima for novel processes of problem formulation. So this is what we put in the description of the presentation of the special issue, right? And what we're expecting to see in a thick description of an entrepreneurship problem, right? Here, you're going to have to, if you decide to work in this space of the special issue, you're going to have to abandon the traditional methods, traditional orientation, the traditional context, the digital way we do research, because normally we are trained to explain, right? And we need to describe, but we do very little in the style of description because we tend to prioritize explanation. That means that we jump very quickly into the space of solution, right? And we leave what's coming before that aside, because it is understood that description is not relevant. Here, description is the key, right? And you have 12 pages to describe a problem, right? And that's generally, 12 pages seems like a very short space, but when you have to describe the problem in the probably you will find that it's a very long document and challenging thing to do. So you need to think about a lot of things, right? So where does the problem exist? That means that you need to embrace context and go deep into it, right? So Richard was just mentioning contextualization is central to this, right? So normally in that sense, your papers will have to be situated in a given place, right? I live, well, Leeds and work at Durham, that's northeast of England, with certain type of situation that are different, very, very different from London and the south of England, right? And Richard, you live in Belfast, and we know that that part of the world also the situation is very, very different from the rest of the UK. So if you move around, right, you might be tackling a situation that is similar, but the problem will take a different shape depending on where you are. So problems need to be grounded in place, in context matters. Then you start looking into the who has been affected by the problem, and again, those individuals are based on that context, and they have a name and a surname, right, and an institution and a certain context, right, that's influencing how they behave. We need to understand who is that person and why they're being affected by that problem. What are the causes of that problem? So what is driving the situation, right, that's currently been affecting entrepreneurs? What are the issues underlying the problem? And how those issues are intertwined, right? So that's very important because again, we're living in a complex world, complex social system. So issues are never independent from each other. We need to understand how they're connected to create this problem space. How the different stakeholders understand and define the problems. You'll find yourself in a situation where you have different voices, explaining how things might work. In entrepreneurship, we have narrative, right? Narrative entrepreneurship, and what an entrepreneur can tell about his or her own journey. The family members, policymakers, support organizations, we all have different views, right? So we need to take into account all the different views to be able to describe adequately a problem. And also think about what would be different, right, if the problem is solved. That makes you think about the relevance, right, of the problem, and try and gain a high level of meaning, if you like, right, in that problem. If you're going to spend 12 pages in an entire research project to try and describe, might as well do it around a problem that is meaningful, right, to those people. And here's a good example, I think. This is a project we did with a PhD student of mine, and what we're trying to understand is the challenges currently that was 2020, affecting support organizations interested in using entrepreneurship as part of rehabilitation processes. Right, so trying to understand the problem. We had no idea what was all about. So we brought in a range of stakeholders from different organizations, using again entrepreneurship and rehabilitation process of in re-employment, homelessness, drug addiction, ex-offenders, youth crime, mental health, and refugee support, and so on. And they're all using entrepreneurship in different ways, and therefore they're all experiencing the challenges, right, of using these tools, not just for the sake of business creation, just the entrepreneurship teaching or education or training. What we teach is very transferable, right, to other domains. So we're trying to figure out, okay, what is what in this space, right? And we engage in collective mapping, and then we produce a draft that we co-created essentially, right? And it's all to do with describing challenges, and we map them out in this framework. It's called the START framework, and it goes through the 5 main challenges these organizations are facing, to do with stigmatizing, the use of time-able knowledge, resource alignment, recognition, and moral treatments, and how all those 5 were affecting levels, right, in service provision, and how they were helping people to step forward, right? So move not, because it is not a return to where they were before, is rehabilitation process where they can just use that to get themselves back into society. But there were many challenges, right? So we produced that sort of a framework and looking across individual processes, facilitation, and content, right? And that's a very thick description of the problem with a lot of questions, right? That if you're a researcher in this space, you can take any of those questions, right? And conduct research, because ultimately what we want to do here out of the, I think, description is provoke research, right? Because we normally work with imaginary problems that we think they're there, but they're not there, because it's in the literature, but nowhere else, right? So it creates an artifact that has been imagined, essentially, right? So what we want is you go deep into the context and trying to figure out what the problem is and how can that problem be presented in a way that it inspires future research. So hopefully the research that's coming next, it will be really solution oriented. Right, and then that it started as a report. In the report, we started sort of working with it with a few other organizations, and then that became actually a JBBI paper that we published back in 2020 with Lee. Right, so I think that's a good. Then there's towards the end of the paper, there's a bit of conceptualization, but you don't need to do that in this case in a thick description, right? So you can just keep it open and descriptive, right? And then present the problem in its whole complexity, if you want, right? And there's the table as well with the same process. Then presented as a agenda. But that is available. I think we have it on ResearchGate, something, so you can download it from there. The report, not the paper. Right. So that's the thick description. Then there's the novel process of problem formulation, and this is. I think you can take it from here, Garima.
All right, thanks.
And recommend that paper.
Thanks, Pablo.
Very good.
This is really
right,
great.
I'll stop here.
Feel free to jump in. Sort of as I'm talking, I'm going to sort of share my screen and just welcome everybody again. It's just so great to see so much interest in the special issue. So what I'm going to talk about, Pablo set up the what. What I'm going to talk about is the how of problem formulation. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide because I suspect a lot of you have seen me talk about this slide a lot. And Pablo did a fantastic job of setting up the why of the special issue. But quickly, the idea is that this research practice gap exists. And because our research fails to impact management practice, for all of the reasons that Pablo and Richard talked about, this notion between descriptive and prescriptive and how we are narrow and deep while practitioners are broad and have many fires to fight every day, how our frameworks are so abstract that they're applied across context while practitioners are looking for concrete advice, and how our publication process can take years while practitioners often don't have the luxury of that time. What I'm going to specifically hone in that both Richard and Pablo mentioned is this idea of collaboration between research and practice, and how sort of a lot of people, including myself and my co-authors, what we've called it is sort of this idea of co-creating both knowledge and solutions for problem of practice. So what is really co-creation? It's when academic researchers and practitioners and entrepreneurs, they set out to research a problem where the interests intersect. So the assumption behind co-creation is that when you come together like that, very similar to the example Pablo just showed about the mapping that he did with the users of the solutions or stakeholders of the solution, that the solutions you produce are both rigorous and relevant. That's sort of the assumption going in. And I also want to point out here that it's not, co-creation is not another research method in your toolkit. It's rather sort of an approach, and I would even say a sensibility that you adopt as a researcher, where you think that the best solution making, the best knowledge production is when we are not siloed, when we are really involving, not just studying, but really creating the knowledge with those who we study or those who get affected by the outcomes we produce. So what I want to do is quickly take you through three different examples from my own research, and one Pablo just sort of showed you. And what my hope is that it's going to inspire you to think about your own research designs of how you can design these co-creation projects, as well as I'm going to share a few key takeaways to give you sort of a sense of, what we can say meaningfully in focusing on the how for this special issue. So let's start with this idea of research practice co-creation. With my co-author Tima Bansal in 2020, we sort of wrote a fair bit about what this co-creation means and looks like, and this is available sort of for you to study if you want. But the focus of both papers was, this Network for Business Sustainability, which is a nonprofit out of Ivy Business School in Canada. What they did was that they brought together about 15-20 Canadian leaders interested in sustainability. Every year they would identify priorities through a whole day of dialogue. So they'll identify 2 priorities that then NBS would put out as calls for researchers to apply to. And then the researchers would conduct research, mostly following a systematic review process, which some of you may know, it's a very well laid out methodology. And then NBS would translate and disseminate. So the step 2 of conduct research is an example of how one can sort of design a co-creation project. So for them, if you look through sort of each of these projects lasted 8 to 9 months, and if you look through each box that I show there, each box really represent one particular step of a systematic review process. So I'm not sort of shortchanging what that rigorous methodology sort of prescribes me to do. What I'm doing as a researcher is bringing the manager, bringing the practitioner with a functional knowledge and functional expertise into each step. So each time we meet, sort of it's really the meeting of minds of research and practice while following this well laid out systematic review method. So some of the key takeaways in sort of studying this process for over 2 years was that, this tension that I described at the beginning between research and practice is really generative. So sort of how do we embrace it? And so some of the outputs of our work is also we've created, infographics, and we've created tables that you can really refer to really understand if you embark on a co-creation project, how can you navigate some of those tensions to get to the best outcome? The other thing we found is that objects matter. Sometimes we get stuck in the differences in words because words are so discipline specific. But when we bring in figures, when we bring in visuals, it can really transcend differences. So that is key to some of, sort of navigating the tension that research practice may face. And then, and very interestingly, you go in expecting these tensions. While we were hearing that, what tension it's what we sort of ultimately sort of arrived at is this idea of process ontology that both researchers and practitioners were adopting in these projects, which means that they were looking at the end of their work. So they had a well-defined time frame. They were looking at what are we producing at the end of our time together, and using that to work through their differences and asking, is this useful? How do we take this decision? Is this useful to produce that end that both of us have agreed upon? So in doing so, tensions were not debilitating or paralyzing as literature tells us and as we expected going in, but they become part of the process. The second piece that I want to tell you is that we published all of that in 2020. And since then, sort of the world has been suffering from this global crisis. And Pablo referred to this, our overwhelming focus on historical evidence, and COVID told us that we can't really keep looking at the past because past is in such disruption, does not predict sort of the future. So when historical evidence cannot inform the future, as well as when we think about managers and practitioners' role in co-creation, they are also, like any person, sort of working from feasibility, what they have done in the past, and how do we really move that conversation to possibility of what is what if, what is possible, not as what has been done, and also challenging a little bit the idea of tension, which started emerging in our prior work. Is it really sort of this debilitating tension that we're talking about when we bring managers and researchers together? So we have an in-press article that I'm happy to send any of you a copy of if you want to look at sort of the design of, the co-creating forward project there. What we focused on is what Tima Bansal at Ivy Business School, she launched 2.5 years ago, the lab at Innovation North. The objective of the lab is really how do we move from a corporate innovation that only looks inwards and their company's profit to systems-based innovation that benefits everyone. At the end of the lab and through the lab, the team is developing an innovation compass, which is a tool that anybody outside the lab can use for systems-based innovation. The tenure of the lab is 2019 to 2024, and the participants meet quarterly. So who is involved? There's a core organizing team of academics. There is a research team. I know Fitzjob is on the call. He's part of the research team. It goes from PhD students to full professors, a lot of variety in there. There is a solutions lab that's part of the team. There are thought leaders and academics that come and give keynotes. And then 25 Canadian businesses, NGOs, and government partners have committed to sort of this 5-year engagement of changing their own innovation process, learning on the way, and helping develop this compass. So in publishing that AMLE piece, a couple of key takeaways that I thought would be worth sharing with all of you is that, as Pablo was saying, our research methods are always looking at the past, while when we conceptualize, the way we conceptualize co-creating forward is that it draws on historical evidence, but the evidence is not determining the conclusions. The approach that researchers and other lab participants follow here is this idea of problem solving. So we are holding our theories lightly and instead asking what is useful from that evidence that can help us solve a problem for the future. We also have a variety of expertise in terms of innovation and sustainability and so on and so forth. So each of us are drawn to different solution-making paths, and how do sort of we bring together all of that to not, again, let the past or the prior evidence and expertise determine the future, but bring them together so that one path, a solution path, emerges. We're also, the way we make sense of this lab is that it's teleologically organized but processually enacted. So the teleology comes from this innovation compass that I mentioned, which at the end of 5 years is going to be available for others to use. So there is a goal that everybody's working toward, and processual enactment comes from really this emergent researcher role. So we're not only holding our theories lightly, we're also holding our expertise and our roles slightly, which is often very hard for academics. So these emergent roles range from facilitators to observers to problem solvers. So depending on how the process emerges, our roles sort of shift and change and emerge. The last one that I want to talk to you about is what Pablo already mentioned, and very key to the special issue is that how problem formulation can be one leverage for research impact. And he mentioned sort of our conditionally accepted article in Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice, and I think probably you've already put it on ResearchGate, so it's probably available for others to access. But I'm not going to get into the details of the ER3 project because Pablo has already explained the details to you, but that's a research context. We took 6 different projects of ER3 and asked what is happening here in terms of problem formulation and solution making. And, just quickly, sort of a lead author in an ER3 sort of expresses interest. They have expertise in an issue. There's an interdisciplinary team that lead authors put together. Very important, also very important for your own efforts for the special issue. There's a problem owner. that sort of is part of the team, which is somebody, a practitioner, an entrepreneur, or an ecosystem builder who's part of who cares about the issue than the editors and the reviewers. Pablo already talked about rapidness from few weeks to a couple of months, and these projects draw on translation science from medical science, that there's an existing body of work and how can we deploy it. What I want to spend just 2 minutes on is our key takeaways from the paper. Again, hoping that you would sort of see what we're looking for in terms of making meaningful contributions through the special issue. So we found 2 equifinal pathways of impact. We call them inward-looking iterative and outward-looking joint pathway. Inward-looking because they were started with curiosity of the researcher, outward looking because they started with a problem of practice, and there are many other moving elements in these parts that we carefully lay out in defining, describing these paths. What we also found through these 2 pathways, it's not just whether a problem owner or practitioner is involved, but also when does a problem owner enter the process that is highly consequential for solutions. And so in the 2 pathways, the problem owner is playing different kinds of roles. And, you know, you can sort of, if you're interested, read the paper. I'm not going to spend too much time, but we do describe in detail what are those different roles. And importantly, it seems obvious, but you know, it was really evident in our data that problems define solution space because each pathway had solutions that were rigorous and relevant and timely, but that rigor, relevance, and timeliness looked very different in both pathways. So again, the choices that researchers and problem owners made throughout the pathway influenced what solution came out at the end, and hence it's highly consequential how you define a problem. So implications for you, we are looking for creative process of problem formulation. Again, these are just examples that I shared with you from my own work. I'm so excited to sort of receive from you your, you know, innovative, creative designs. We're thinking hackathons and community mapping and design workshops, stakeholder summits, crowdsourcing, whatever sort of you've been involved in, or you even want to launch, given that it's a rolling deadline for this special issue. So if you think that after today you have this great idea of launching something, please talk to us and how we can help in sort of helping you sort of get there. And again, I hope what you're taking away from the 3 examples I shared with you is that we're not simply looking for papers to just list concrete practices that others can use. We are looking for that, but we are also looking for meaningful insights and contributions to the field of entrepreneurship, and that would be an important criteria as well. I'm going to stop here. I hope I didn't run too much out of time. I also want to say one last thing. When sort of Pablo shared the 2 thick description and process of problem formulation, in the call for proposal, we also have personal essays. So if any of you have any questions about this personal essay piece of the call for proposal, please feel free to ask this question right now or offline to us, but I'm going to stop here.
Thanks so much, Garima. Thanks very much, Pablo and Richard as well. I think that gives us a lot of food for thought, and also that makes it more clear about what this special issue is expecting from the authors. And as you probably have seen in the chat box, Garima has shared a template. So basically the editorial team for this virtual special issue has put together a template. We call it a template, but it's more like a guidance. So we encourage creativity. So don't be limited by this. We just want to line out to describe what we wanted. So you can think through your ideas. So that's help for you, but not a constraint. And also Richard has shared a source on problems, context, and involvement. So that's the 2 things. And I think we have maybe 6 minutes to take some questions. I can see already in the chat box, there are two persons asking questions. So I will let you speak out your question directly. Fridtjof, would you like to start first? Because I saw you have some comments and also a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess the the idea basically is, isn't there a way to be entrepreneurial about this problem itself? So it seems like we are in some ways stuck in kind of like an institutionalized regime where we seem to be, having quite predefined what the outcome should be, what the approach should be, etc. So I'm challenging ourselves. Isn't there a way that we could be entrepreneurial ourselves about dealing with these problems? Also in the way that we do scholarship?
I mean, I guess that's exactly the point of what we're trying to do here. So in a case one, and the what is to try and figure out what those problems are using description, which is already something that it doesn't happen too often in academic research, where we'll always tend to explain and solve it, and we don't really reflect much on what problem exists behind it. And for that, you can find inspiration in beyond management, right? So how all the disciplines go about describing problems, right? And then studying a given situation, right? Studying and describing a given situation. So in my research, I've done collective scoping, community mapping, events, workshops, and there are many other ways in which you can do that collaboratively. And the second bit, it's about studying the how that might happen, and that also opens the door to innovation and how can we actually do that, right? Because currently the methods we have at hand, they're not very particularly conducive to develop, to co-create knowledge, or to, in this case, to co-frame problems, right? So it takes quite a while, right, for people to engage in those sort of collaboration. So I think that's exactly what you were saying. That's exactly what we're looking for, right? Innovation in the what and how we do, we develop problems.
Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Thanks both.
Yeah, I think if I can add to what Pablo said, on that, I think there still remains a tension that the change of focus that we're talking about may be easier to achieve on the margins of what currently sits as the discipline. There is a tension between that sort of innovation and the implications for recognition and reward and how the system currently is configured. And that's one of the tensions I think we have to negotiate in exploring new ways of formulating problems and changing the orientation, moving from a theory orientation to a problem orientation. We are kind of challenging the basis on which Western science, and I use the term to refer to all forms of organized knowledge, has grown up over the last 200 years. And is based on specialization, differentiation, and theory orientation. We're really talking about a change, not just in the how and the why of what we do, but a change in the fundamental underlying philosophical rationale behind what we're doing.
Thanks, I agree here.
Thanks, Richard. And I think we can answer another question that is posed by Rosella. Would you like to ask a question? I'm not sure if she's still there. So I will ask a question on her behalf, because it might be of interest to other people too. So her question is, how do you think we as researchers can involve the community in our research? I think it's already been touched a little bit, but if there's anyone want to add a bit more, that would be great.
And the one thing that I would like to add is that, it's so time consuming. The pressures, the institutional pressure of publishing are there, and in parallel, sort of involving community, all of us sort of, in a way, we're preaching to the choir, right? Like all of us drank the Kool-Aid. So we do want to involve community. We do want our research impact practice. But again, it's sort of in tension with these pressures of publishing not fast, but publishing in certain kind of outlets. And so I think for I don't know if Rosella is, early career scholar, but, I have, my focus is really sort of so much on early career scholars who really want to do this work, in the sense that, think of it as what teams, what conversations can you join, and not think about community engagement as sort of this solo, war effort that you get on. Pablo shared he did his community mapping with his PhD student. I shared in the Innovation North Lab. We have this whole spectrum of career stages. So really thinking strategically about, what team and conversation you can join when we're thinking about involving community. Yeah.
So I think it's not a prerequisite itself, but I think it's very important. It's really difficult to get what's going on in a context without immersing yourself in that context, right? As an helicopter view of problems, I don't think you'll have a good understanding of that problem. And there's on the what side. It doesn't mean that you have to create the network yourself, right? And lead the engagement, because the time-consuming bit is the time it takes to set it up. But engaging conversation doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have to set it up yourself, right? So you can engage in conversations that are already happening, right? So business breakfast, or you can just go to open forums that they're already set up, right? So local council, I don't know, there are many instances where people meet and discuss issues that are relevant to them, right? They're trying to set agendas for the future and so on. So there are already things happening. You can join and become part of that conversation instead of setting up yourself. But I find it's very difficult, right, to get a sense of what's going on without engagement.
Okay, that's great. I think that's a very nice summary of this first part of this workshop. And I'd like to thank everyone again for joining the first part. And for those who have, we hope you find the presentations useful. And if you're interested in submitting to this virtual special issue, we welcome you to discuss your paper ideas or research design with the guest editors, as you can see on this slide. We look forward to receiving your submissions. Thank you.